Okay, let's do this. Mrbeast, 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 almost said it wrong. Mrbeast, 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 Red Shop, Mrbeast, 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 and Mrbeast, 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 Beast, Mrbeast, 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 Mrbeast. Oh God, this hurts. Mrbeast, Mrbeast. I'm about to go to 50, but they do more. Mrbeast, 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 Mrbeast. Oh, I'm already getting tired. Mrbeast, 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 Mr. Can I? It's like so late right now when I'm doing this. Mrbeast, 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 Mrbeast. Mrbeast, 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 Mrbeast. Yay, 100. Mrbeast, Mrbeast, Mrbeast. Hello, Mrbeast. Beast, Mrbeast. This is Super Mrbeast. 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 Mrbeast, 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 Beast, that did not count. Mrbeast, 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 Mrbeast. I said it wrong. Mrbeast, 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 Mrbeast. Say it wrong. Mrbeast, 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 Mr. Beast, 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 MrBeast, MrBeast, Mr. B, MrBeast, 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 MrBeast. My throat hurts right now. MrBeast, 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 Mr. Things. MrBeast, 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 Mr. Beast, MrBeast, 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 Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mrs. Beast. Yeah, I don't know. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Oh my God, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, and go on MrBeast.com. I forgot MrBeastShop.com, I think. Yeah, we did it. We did it. Why not do 5 more? MrBeast. I could have done so 5, but I won't. Wow. This was pretty long actually. Did not actually for it to be so long. And I hope I am recording. If not, I'm gonna lines quit.
On my watch.
Okay, 10 more. MrBeast, 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 MrBeast. I should do not the Leo version. Okay, I don't care.